The lane narrows before the castle comes into view. It descends from open farmland at the ridge into something older and denser, and the change happens gradually enough that there is no single moment when the light goes, only the slow accumulation of branches overhead until the sky has become a series of gaps between leaves rather than a continuous open thing. Oak and ash meet above the lane. The canopy closes. The quality of the air shifts from the bright, slightly thin air of the Devon uplands into something cooler and stiller and faintly green smelling, the way air smells when it has been sitting among roots and moss for a long time and has taken on some of the character of the ground. The lane is narrow enough in places that two people walking abreast would brush the verge on both sides. The surface is uneven in the way of tracks that were laid down for a different scale of traffic and have been maintained since then, only enough to remain passable. The trees press close, and somewhere below, before anything has come into view, the sound of water arrives, a brook running in a ravine that the lane has been descending toward without the ravine itself becoming visible. The water present first as sound, a low and steady murmur rising through the trees from somewhere out of sight in the green below. Barry Pomeroy Castle is approximately 1 mile east of the market town of Totnes, in the South Hams region of Devon. It sits on a steep-sided ridge above the Gatcombe Brook, and that approach through the woodland is the approach that visitors have been making for centuries. The lane has changed in its surface and in its edges, and the woodland around it has changed in its individual trees, but the basic geography has not. The descent from the open ridge, the closing canopy, the brook below announcing itself before the ruins appear. Whatever else the castle has accumulated in 900 years of continuous human attention, it has always had this approach, this particular transition from open air to enclosed green, this sound of water rising from a ravine the lane has not yet reached. The castle takes its name from a family who arrived in England with an army. The Della Pomerai were Norman lords who came to Devon in the aftermath of William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066, and the manor of Barry was among the territories distributed to them in the reorganization of English landholding that followed that battle. The name itself carries a small piece of that history, Barry from the Old English for a fortified place, Pomeroy from the family who held it. The two halves of the name sit together in a way that marks the exact point of overlap between the older English landscape and the Norman administrative structure laid across it. The place name that already existed, and the family name attached to it by whoever was doing the recording in that first generation of new ownership. The Della Pomerai held Barry for roughly 5 centuries. That is a long time to hold a piece of Devon. It encompasses the Black Death and several cycles of agricultural prosperity and collapse, the slow changes in how English great families organized their households and displayed their wealth, and a great deal of ordinary Devon weather. The family's connection to the land here lasted long enough that the name stopped meaning anything specific about where the family came from, and simply became the name of the place the family dissolved into the landscape over the course of those 500 years, in the way that families in long-held English manors tend to become indistinguishable from the place itself. The most substantial stonework still standing at Barry Pomeroy dates from the 14th and 15th centuries, from the period when the family was at something close to the height of its local power, and chose to express that power in permanent dressed stone. The curtain wall that defines the castle's outer boundary is D-shaped in its plan, enclosing an area of roughly 2 acres, and in its scale and construction, it represents a serious piece of medieval engineering. The gatehouse that forms the primary entrance through this wall, St. Margaret's Tower, rises to most of its original height and retains the portcullis groove scored into the stone on either side of the entrance passage, a pair of channels cut precisely into the dressed stonework to guide the iron-shod timber of the portcullis as it descended. The grooves are smooth and exact, worn to a particular finish by use, and they survive because stone keeps the record of what was done to it far better than wood or iron or the purposes those materials served. The curtain wall itself describes the castle's outer boundary with a kind of settled authority. The D shape is not accidental. The straight side of the D faces the approach from the south, the curved side following the natural contour of the ridge above the ravine, taking advantage of the topography rather than fighting it. The medieval builders worked with the land they had. The wall rises above the tree line on the valley floor, and from certain angles below catches the late afternoon light of a Devon day in a way that makes the limestone warm rather than gray, a quality of the local stone, which is neither purely yellow nor purely red, but somewhere between, a warm Devon color that architects and builders have been using in this region for a very long time. Beneath the open sky at the top of the lane, before the descent into the trees, on a clear afternoon, the ridge still looks broadly as it would have looked to someone arriving here for the first time in the 15th century, the wall rising above the green, the gatehouse towers visible, the whole arrangement reading clearly as a place that was built to be seen from this direction and to make a particular impression on whoever was looking up from the approach. The impression it makes has changed because what was then inhabited and maintained and occupied is now open to the sky and slowly returning some of its material to the woodland around it. But the sight reading the basic grammar of a fortified place on a Devon ridge above a wooded ravine has not changed at all. 5 centuries of Pomeroy ownership came to an end in 1547. Sir Thomas Pomeroy sold the estate to Edward Seymour, and the sale was the conclusion of a process that had probably been coming for some time, the gradual decline of a family's connection to a property that had been central to its identity for so long that the family and the property had almost become the same thing. Edward Seymour was not a minor Devon squire. He was the first Duke of Somerset, Lord Protector of England, during the minority of the young King Edward VI, one of the most powerful men in the country at that moment, a figure operating at a scale entirely different from the family he was buying from. The timing of the sale placed it at one of the more turbulent junctures in 16th century English history, the years immediately following the death of Henry VIII, the beginning of the reign of a 9-year-old king, the competition among the men around that king for precedence and power. Seymour occupied the top of that structure, and his acquisition of Barry Pomeroy was part of a broader pattern of estate building appropriate to his position. A great lord needed great properties. Barry Pomeroy, with its medieval walls and its Devon acres, was a property worth having, and Seymour could afford to improve it to a standard befitting his new rank. The improvement he began was substantial. Within the existing medieval curtain walls, the Seymour family started constructing a large 3-story Renaissance mansion, a building of considerable ambition, incorporating the architectural fashions of continental Europe into a Devon hillside inside a medieval enclosure. The mullioned windows that survive in the ruins today, long horizontal lights subdivided by stone uprights in the Renaissance manner, were part of that construction. The decorated string courses, horizontal bands of carved stonework marking each floor level on the exterior face of the building, were part of it too. The formal entrance porch, executed in the warm Devon limestone with decorative carved details that follow the Renaissance vocabulary arriving in England in these decades, was the public face of the Seymour ambition expressed in stone. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that building would have looked like when it was new and occupied. Inside the medieval walls, walls that already carried 5 centuries of Devon weather and the accumulated associations of long Pomeroy ownership, a new building of 3 stories was rising, with large windows admitting more light than medieval buildings typically allowed, with decorative stonework on its exterior announcing wealth and continental sophistication, with formal interior arrangements of rooms suited to the entertaining and administration appropriate to a duke. The medieval and the Renaissance sat together within those 2 acres, the older fabric of the curtain walls enclosing something significantly newer and more fashionable, the combination producing a place that was neither purely a medieval castle nor purely a Renaissance mansion, but something specific to this particular site and this particular moment. Edward Seymour did not live to see the mansion completed. His position as Lord Protector was precarious from the beginning, dependent on maintaining the confidence of the council around the young king, and in 1549 he lost that position. He was executed in 1552. The mansion at Barry Pomeroy passed to his descendants, and the building work continued under the Seymour family across the following decades, but the patron who had initiated it was gone almost before it was properly begun. The building program that was started under him was ambitious enough that it outlasted his lifetime by a considerable margin, and the ruins that survive today are the record of what that ambition looked like when it was interrupted and left open to the sky. The Seymour family retained Barry Pomeroy for approximately a century and a half after the original purchase, and in that time the estate was a working property, a place where people lived, where household arrangements were maintained, where the ordinary business of a great Devon family was conducted against the backdrop of the partially completed Renaissance mansion and the medieval walls. The records of that occupation are not extensive, but the physical evidence of it is still legible in the ruins, the scale of the rooms, the quality of the decorative stonework, the arrangement of the entrance range alongside the older fabric, all speak to a family that took the property seriously and invested in it continuously across several generations. The occupation ended in the 1690s. The last Seymour residents departed from Barry Pomeroy during that decade, and the precise reasons are not entirely clear. A combination of changed fortunes, shifting residential preferences among the English aristocracy, and possibly the practical difficulties of maintaining a large and only partially completed building in a Devon woodland. What is clear is that the departure happened, and that it was effectively permanent. The family retained ownership of the site but stopped inhabiting it, and the building began immediately to do what buildings do when the people who were responsible for their maintenance are no longer present: to settle, to let water in, to begin the slow process of returning to the landscape. The decade or so after the departure would have produced rapid changes visible to anyone who had known the building in its occupied state. Roofing materials are the first thing to fail when maintenance stops, and once a roof goes, the rest follows with increasing speed. Water enters, floors soften, timbers rot. The plasterwork that covered the interior walls, which would have been decorated in the manner of a late 17th century great house, began to damp and fall. The furnishings would have been removed, or had already been removed before the final departure, leaving the rooms bare of everything except the built fabric of the walls and floors, and the rapidly deteriorating internal woodwork. By the early years of the 18th century, Barry Pomeroy Castle was substantially roofless. The process had taken perhaps 20 or 30 years from departure to full exposure, and by the time anyone came to look at it with systematic attention, It was already what it remains today, an enclosed ruin, the curtain walls still standing, the shell of the Seymour mansion rising in places to its full 3 stories, but open at the top, the interior spaces floored with rubble and vegetation rather than the polished stone and wood of an inhabited house. Devon rain moves through empty window openings differently from the way it moves through glazed ones. There is no resistance to it. The mullioned stone frames that held the glass are still there, the uprights still dividing the opening into their original proportions. But what they frame now is not a view from inside a room, but a view from inside a ruin. And when the rain comes, which in Devon is often, and on that ridge above the Gatcombe Brook is particularly reliably often, it enters the window openings as freely as the wind does, and falls on the same stone floors that the Devon air falls on, and collects in the same low points, and saturates the same vegetation. The sound of an early 18th century Barry Pomeroy, roofless and recently abandoned, would have been the sound of wind and rain, and the brook below, and nothing else. Not voices, not footsteps on polished floors, not the creak of a door. The building that had been designed to house a great family and its household, with its formal rooms and its decorated stonework and its Renaissance ambitions, had become a place through which weather moved freely, and the only acoustic interior was the irregular echo of rain on stone walls open to the sky. The Gatcombe Brook continued in the ravine below. It had been running there before the de la Pomeroy arrived in Devon. It had been running when the curtain walls were built, and when Edward Seymour purchased the estate, and when the Seymour family departed. The brook does not register the history of the castle above it in any recoverable way. It simply runs, as water does, following the contour of the land down through the South Hams toward the sea, carrying dissolved limestone and suspended leaf matter and the various ordinary contents of a Devon stream. The sound of it, rising through the woodland to the empty rooms above, was neither a commentary on what had happened to the castle, nor an indifference to it. It was simply a brook, running in a ravine, in Devon, in the dark. The early 18th century was a period in which the deliberate ruin had not yet become fashionable in English landscape design. That taste would arrive later, and Barry Pomeroy would eventually benefit from the attention of antiquarians and travelers who came to appreciate the picturesque qualities of a genuine medieval and Renaissance ruin in woodland. But in those first decades after the Seymour departure, before anyone had thought to frame the castle as a visual or historical amenity, it was simply an empty building in a landscape that was quietly reclaiming it. The woodland pressed a little closer each year. The ivy found its purchase on the lower walls. The moss accumulated in the joints of the dressed stonework. The ash and oak in the ravine continued growing upward, and their canopy thickened, and the light that reached the castle floor shifted season by season as the trees grew. What remained of the Seymour mansion's entrance porch faced the weather with a kind of residual dignity. The carved stonework of the porch had been executed with care. The pilasters and moldings of the Renaissance vocabulary were still legible in the stone, still carrying the intention of the craftsman who had cut them 150 years earlier, still arranged to make a particular impression on whoever was approaching the formal entrance. What had changed was the context. The impression the porch made was now entirely different from the impression it had been designed to make, not because the stone had changed, but because everything around it had. The glazed windows were gone, the roof was gone, the household that would have been visible through those windows and moving through that entrance was gone. The porch stood in the open air of the Devon woodland, making its decorative argument to no particular audience. The entrance passage of St. Margaret's Tower, its portcullis grooves still cut into the stone on either side, still framed a view of the courtyard beyond. In the late afternoon of an early 18th century day, the light would have entered the passage at the low angle that afternoon light takes in Devon, throwing the texture of the dressed stonework into relief, illuminating the far side of the courtyard through the arch while the passage itself remained in shade. The view through that arch, the courtyard filled now with grass and rubble, and the seedlings of trees finding their way between the stones, the roofless mansion beyond, was a different view from the one the portcullis groove had been cut to serve. The gate mechanism that had controlled access to this courtyard was long gone. The stone that had guided it was still there, precise and intentional, serving no function now except to record that there had been a function. A portcullis groove is a specific kind of evidence. It tells you that someone cut a vertical channel in dressed stone to a particular width and depth, that this was done with sufficient skill and care, that the groove is still clean-edged, centuries later, that the mechanism it was made to guide must have been used regularly enough to polish the stone where the iron ran, and that at some point the mechanism was removed and the groove ceased to serve its purpose, but the stone remained. The stone keeps the record of the function long after the function has ended. In that way, it is similar to many things the castle contains: the mullioned window openings without their glazing, the string courses marking floor levels on a building that no longer has floors, the decorated porch leading into rooms that have no roofs. The physical grammar of the place is still entirely legible. What it described is no longer there. The light at Barry Pomeroy changes in a particular way toward the end of a Devon afternoon. The sun descends behind the ridge to the southwest, and the shadow of the woodland begins to climb the eastern face of the ruins from the bottom up, the lower courses going into shade first. The upper reaches of the curtain wall and the highest surviving fragments of the mansion walls catching the last of the direct sunlight for a period of perhaps 20 minutes before the whole site falls into the even, slightly greenish, diffused light of a woodland afternoon in its final hour. In that transition period, with the lower walls in shadow and the upper stones still lit, the castle reads as two separate things simultaneously: the heavy and ancient and shaded lower fabric, and the warm and still illuminated upper courses catching a light that will not last. The Devon limestone is not a uniform color. In direct sunlight, it reads warm, a mixture of ochre and rose and pale gray that the late afternoon light intensifies toward the orange end of the spectrum. In diffused or overcast light, it reads cooler, grayer, the color flattening toward the general gray-green of lichen and shadow. This variability is part of what makes the castle visually different on different visits, different hours, different seasons. The stone is responsive to the light in a way that more uniform building materials are not, and the woodland setting amplifies the effect by filtering and coloring the light that reaches the walls. The castle does not look the same twice. The basic geometry is constant. The walls are where they were, the arches are where they were, but the color and texture of the whole thing shifts with the sky. In the early 18th century, with the building newly empty and the formal maintenance of the site no longer ongoing, the vegetation would have been beginning its movement into the spaces the building had formerly occupied. The courtyard, which in the occupied period would have been a maintained surface, used for the ordinary traffic of a household, was becoming something else, a space in which grass established itself between the stone flags, and in which the wind-borne seeds of ash and hazel and oak found the substrate they needed in the accumulated debris of a building left open to the weather. The process is a slow one. Individual plants are slow, but populations of plants over decades are persistent in a way that individual plants are not, and the movement of vegetation into an empty human structure is, on the time scale of a building's life, relatively rapid. The first generation of visitors to Barry Pomeroy as a ruin rather than a residence would have found it in this early stage of reclamation, the courtyard walls still mostly clear of the major vegetation that would accumulate in subsequent centuries. The floors of the ruined mansion still partly legible as floors rather than as woodland ground. The whole site still close enough to its inhabited state that the scale and arrangement of the original building was relatively easy to read. Later visitors, coming in the 19th century and beyond, would find a site more thoroughly integrated into its woodland setting, the distinction between the managed castle and the surrounding forest harder to draw, the vegetation more established in every joint and crevice and corner, the approach down the lane through the closing canopy with the brook audible in the ravine below. This remained constant through all of those changes. The lane was there when the castle was occupied, and it was there when the castle was newly empty, and it has been there in every intermediate state since. The trees overhead have changed, their individual lives far shorter than the castle's history, the canopy renewing itself in a cycle of growth and fall, and regrowth that operates on a different time scale from the stone below. But the shape of the descent, from the open ridge down through the enclosed green toward the sound of the brook, has not changed in any essential way. The morning after a Devon rain is a particular thing. The air carries the smell of wet limestone and wet leaf and wet earth, and the sound of the brook is fuller than it was the day before, the additional water from the overnight rainfall running down through the ravine and adding its volume to the constant. The stone walls of the castle are dark with moisture along their lower courses, the water having wicked up through the masonry from the saturated ground, and the moss on the shaded surfaces is a more saturated green than it will be a week into a dry spell. The light that comes through the trees on a morning after rain is a washed light, cleaner and slightly brighter than the usual filtered woodland light. The dust that softens and yellows the air having been rinsed out overnight. The castle in the early 18th century, with that already roofless and open to Devon rain for perhaps 3 decades by then, would have been thoroughly wet after such a night, every surface moistened, the stone floors of the ruined rooms pooled in their low points, the carved decorative details of the entrance porch dark with moisture, and the biological material that accumulates in carved recesses exposed to Devon weather. The sound inside those empty rooms, if inside is even the right word for roofless spaces, would have been primarily the sound of water finding its way through the masonry, the tick and drip of draining stone, and from somewhere below the fuller rush of the brook, audible more clearly on such a morning than on a dry one. No sound of voices, no sound of domestic activity, no sound of the household that the building had been designed and constructed to contain, only the rain finishing its business in the deafened stone, and the brook below going on as it always had, and the woodland pressing its quiet green weight against the curtain walls on every side, and wind where there had been windows, and open sky where there had been roof, and the large and unhurried quiet of an old place no longer occupied, settling into the landscape at its own pace, in its own Devon weather, without particular urgency and without any particular end in view. The walls continued to stand. They stood because they had been built to stand. The medieval masons who set the curtain wall's foundations into the bedrock of the Devon Ridge had not been building for a generation or a century, but for the indefinite future that skilled builders always have in mind when they work in good stone. The portcullis groove was still clean, The string courses on the mansion walls still marked their floor levels with precision. The arch of St. Margaret's Tower still described its curve against the sky, with the sureness of a shape that has found its equilibrium and intends to keep it. Devon rain came through the window openings and fell on Devon stone. The brook ran below. The woodland grew up around the walls. And the castle, having seen 500 years of one family and a century and a half of another, settled into the long quiet of an abandoned place, patient in the manner of stone, indifferent to category, simply present on its ridge above the Gatcombe Brook, while the oak trees grew, and the seasons moved through it, and the rain continued to come. The dungeon entrance at Barry Pomeroy sits at the base of the curtain wall, set back slightly from the main line of the stonework, a low passage descending away from the open courtyard into the older, heavier dark below. Standing at its threshold on an ordinary afternoon, the change is immediate. The air cools by several degrees within a single step. The ambient sounds of the courtyard, birdsong from the woodland edge, the distant murmur of the Gatcombe Brook somewhere in the ravine below, recede as though a door has been closed behind, though no door exists. The stone on either side of the entrance is rougher than the dressed ashlar of the gatehouse above, older in its texture, worn smooth in some places by what might be centuries of hands passing close to the wall in the narrow space. The light does not penetrate far. A few feet in, the passage deepens into a shade that afternoon sun cannot resolve. This is where the White Lady is said to appear. The legend, as it has been recorded and retold across more than 2 centuries of accounts, identifies her as Lady Margaret Pomeroy. In the story, as local tradition carries it, Margaret was imprisoned here by her own sister Eleanor, whose reason was jealousy, a passion strong enough, the old accounts suggest, to extend to the most extreme available expression. Margaret, according to the legend, was left in the dungeon not to await release or punishment in any formal sense, but simply to be forgotten. The accounts do not agree on how long she lived in the dark below the castle that had been her family's home. They agree only on what happened and on what is said to remain. The figure reported at this location across the decades and centuries is described in consistent, specific terms. She is luminous. The light she produces is not the sharp brightness of anything that belongs to the ordinary world, but a softer, slower kind, the kind that seems to emanate rather than reflect. She is female, and her dress in those accounts that describe it in any detail is pale enough that the name the legend settled on long ago still fits the image precisely. The White Lady. The name is plain. The image it describes is plain. What makes it hold across so many separate tellings is that the plainness never varies. Most accounts include one additional detail. The figure raises one arm. The hand extends outward toward whoever is watching from the courtyard side of the passage. The gesture is slow in most descriptions. It does not appear aggressive or sudden. It has the quality, in the way it is most often characterized, of something between an invitation and a warning. Local tradition settled quite early on the interpretation of this gesture as an omen, not necessarily a dark one in every version, but a significant one, a signal that something in the life of the witness was about to change. The raised hand was not meaningless. It meant something. What exactly it meant depended on the account and the teller, but the gesture itself was consistent enough that it became one of the defining features of this particular legend. The detail by which the White Lady of Barry Pomeroy is distinguished from the general category of pale female apparitions that populate English folklore. The second legend belongs to a different figure, in a different part of the castle, with a different quality of presence entirely. The Blue Lady is associated with the interior spaces of the Seymour Mansion, the three-story Renaissance structure built within the medieval walls in the decades after the Pomeroy family's departure, now open to the sky, its floors gone, its roof long since fallen away, its rooms connected by doorway openings through which the Devon woodland is visible in every direction. These are not enclosed spaces in the way the dungeon is enclosed. They are roofless and full of light on clear days, the sound of the brook rising easily through the window openings, the sky overhead a constant presence above the remaining walls. The ruins of the mansion have a different character from the older medieval fabric around them. They are more obviously domestic in their original intention: mullioned windows, a grand entrance porch, the remains of decorative stonework on what were once formal reception rooms, and the daylight that fills them now makes the absence of everything that once made them inhabited feel more present rather than less. The Blue Lady's origin story is darker than Margaret's, and the accounts that carry it are less unified in their details. What persists across the different versions is the nature of the event said to have occurred: an act of violence directed at an infant committed within the mansion's walls. The historical circumstances that might have surrounded such an event are left vague in most tellings. The legend does not name its protagonist with the same confidence that the White Lady legend names Margaret Pomeroy. It offers instead a general shape, a woman, a secret, a child, a consequence that the walls of the mansion absorbed and have not entirely released. The Blue Lady is said to haunt these roofless rooms, where the White Lady is passive, standing in her passage and raising her hand in a gesture that the witness interprets but cannot fully read. The Blue Lady is described in multiple accounts as something more active, a presence that seems to be aware of those moving through the ruins, that registers the attention of a visitor in a way that the White Lady, fixed in her threshold, does not. Several accounts note that she is most often encountered near the unguarded edges of the ruined structure, the points where a floor once existed and no longer does, where a wall ends abruptly and the drop to the rubble below is unprotected. This detail has accumulated its own layer of interpretation over the years of retelling. Some versions suggest that the Blue Lady's proximity to these dangerous edges carries an implied intention toward whoever she appears to. Others are less directive than that, noting simply that those who report encountering her tend to have been standing close to a drop and register a compulsion to step back when the awareness of her presence arrives. The first substantial written record of supernatural experience at Barry Pomeroy comes from the early decades of the 19th century. The person who recorded it was Sir Walter Farquhar, a physician who had held a senior medical appointment to the Prince of Wales, and who visited the ruins near Totnes on an afternoon that is not precisely dated in the account he left behind. Farquhar was not, by the evidence of his writing, a man inclined to superstition. His account has the quality of someone describing a thing he saw rather than a thing he wished to have seen, precise in its observation of what happened, measured in its resistance to any single explanation, honest about the moment when what he took to be an ordinary figure in the ruins became something he could no longer account for in ordinary terms. What Farquhar described was a figure near the dungeon entrance. He noticed her from some distance across the courtyard and assumed, initially, that she was another visitor to the ruins, a reasonable assumption for anyone walking through what was already, by the early 19th century, a recognized antiquarian destination. He watched her for some time. He noted, in the account he left, that something about the quality of her presence struck him as unusual. though he was careful to acknowledge that he could not initially have said what that quality was. She stood near the dungeon entrance. He continued walking toward the area. At some point during his approach, she was no longer there. The courtyard at Barry Pomeroy is not a large space. The opportunities for a person to leave it without being observed are limited to a small number of obvious exits. Farquhar noted all of them, and noted that none of them showed any sign of recent movement. The figure he had been watching had not walked away. She had simply ceased to be visible between one moment and the next, in a space where visible movement in any direction should have been detectable. What gives this account its particular weight in the tradition is not its drama. It is, in fact, a notably understated piece of writing, but its specificity. Farquhar named the location. He described what he saw in terms that match the spatial details of the dungeon entrance precisely. He did not embellish the account with meaning. He recorded what he observed and left the question of what it signified, if anything, deliberately open. The account has been cited by subsequent writers on the castle's reputation, not because it is the most dramatic record in the archive, but because it is one of the earliest, and because it established the spatial pattern that later accounts would follow, without, for the most part, any apparent awareness of Farquhar's record. That spatial consistency is worth dwelling on. The dungeon entrance, the curtain wall in the area of St. Margaret's Tower, the interior of the Seymour Mansion, these locations appear in accounts separated by more than 2 centuries, described by people with no demonstrable connection to one another and no obvious access to the same sources. A figure near the dungeon entrance, pale and luminous, raising a hand, a presence in the roofless mansion rooms, near the edges, creating in those who encounter her a specific physical response of withdrawal. The details that vary across accounts are the details of context, the time of day, the weather, the circumstances of the witness, the emotional register they bring to what they describe. The details that do not vary are the spatial ones, the location, the gesture, the quality of presence. The ghost story as a cultural form is very old, and it has always carried within it a tension between 2 different functions. On one side, it is a mechanism for processing something that happened, a violent death, an injustice, an act that the official record absorbed but did not resolve. The ghost returns because something was left unfinished. The story of Margaret Pomeroy, imprisoned in the dark below her family's castle by her own sister, is, at its core, a story about an act so contained and private that no external accounting for it was possible. The dungeon is below the courtyard, below the daily life of the castle, below visibility. What happens there happens in the complete absence of witnesses. The ghost is, in this reading, the only witness left. On the other side, the ghost story is a way of marking a place as significant, of insisting that this particular location, this specific passage or room or edge of wall, carries a weight that cannot be accounted for purely in terms of its physical dimensions. The Blue Lady in the roofless rooms of the Seymour Mansion is not, in most accounts, a figure to be understood or appeased. She is a fact of the location in the way that the stream below and the walls above are facts of it. She belongs to the mansion the way the ivy belongs to the north wall. She persists. The transmission of these particular legends across the long history of the site is not a matter of continuous institutional record. The stories did not travel through official channels or formal written sources alone. They were carried in conversation, in the kind of local knowledge that passes between people who live near a place and have their own relationships with it. The inhabitants of Totnes and the villages of the South Hams knew Barry Pomeroy as part of their landscape long before it became a nationally recognized haunted site. They had their own reasons for the stories, their own versions of the details, their own sense of which elements were essential and which could be adjusted without loss. What the written record captures is not the whole of this transmission, but a series of moments when someone decided to put down on paper what they had heard or experienced. The Victorian antiquarians who moved through Devon in the mid to late 19th century, collecting local traditions and oral testimonies, found the Barry Pomeroy legends already well established and internally consistent in their spatial details. The accounts they recorded from local residents, a figure seen near the tower walls at dusk, a sense of presence in the ruined mansion rooms that arrived without warning and departed the same way, matched the earlier records in their geography even when they varied in their particulars. The curtain wall near St. Margaret's Tower, the dungeon entrance, the roofless rooms of the Seymour Range, these locations recur with the regularity of coordinates. There is a Victorian antiquarian's account that has been cited by several later writers on Barry Pomeroy, though its precise date and the identity of its author are not always given with the same certainty in every source. The scene it describes is ordinary in its setting, a Devon afternoon, a walk through the ruins that had become a recognized stopping point for the educated traveler, and the experience it records is quiet in the way that the most persistent accounts tend to be. A figure near the tower, a moment of recognition that something was not as it should be, the absence quickly following. These accounts share a quality that is harder to describe than the spatial details they contain. None of them are frightened accounts, in the sense of a witness overwhelmed by terror and unable to observe clearly. They have instead a quality of arrested attention, the experience of a person who was watching something with complete focus because something about what they were watching demanded that focus. Farquhar's account has this quality. The Victorian testimonies have it. The more recent reports from those who have visited the site in the context of organized investigation have it in different ways, shaped by a different cultural relationship to the possibility of what they might encounter, but recognizable as the same fundamental experience of careful, complete attention directed at a specific place in the ruins. St. Margaret's Tower in late evening light has a particular quality that even the most purely architectural account of the site tends to acknowledge. The rounded flanking towers that frame the entrance passage cast shadows of considerable length across the courtyard as the afternoon ends, shadows that shift and lengthen steadily as the sun moves, so that the area around the dungeon entrance passes through a series of different light conditions over the course of a single day. In the morning, direct light reaches the entrance passage and the area immediately before it. By late afternoon, the gateway's own shadow has advanced across the courtyard toward the dungeon steps, and the entrance below sits in a shade that deepens progressively as the evening comes on. In twilight, the contrast between the lit upper stones of the tower and the deep shade at the base of the wall is at its most pronounced. The tower stands in full visibility, while the dungeon entrance below has already become part of the dark. Those who have spent time at the site at different hours describe this daily transition as producing a marked change in how the space is experienced, not threatening, but distinctly different from the midday experience of the same location. The shadows are long, and the contrast is strong, and the lower parts of the walls carry, in that light, the weight of the depth of stone behind them more fully than they do in the diffuse light of an overcast afternoon. The dungeon entrance, in this particular light, is not simply a passage going down. It is a threshold between two different registers of the day, the still-lit world of the courtyard and the earlier dark that has already arrived below. Margaret Pomeroy, in the legend as it is most widely transmitted, has been in that dark for a very long time. The story of imprisonment and starvation is, as a motif in English and European folk tradition, an old one. The wronged woman, confined by a jealous sibling or rival, appears in a wide variety of regional traditions across Britain and the continent, and the specific details that distinguish the Barry Pomeroy version, Eleanor's jealousy, Margaret's beauty, the dungeon below the family's own castle, the slow nature of the death, have the character of a story that has been shaped by many tellings into its current form, each retelling smoothing away the inconsistencies and emphasizing the details that carry the emotional weight most efficiently. A story that has been told this many times in this many contexts develops a kind of structural integrity. The essential details resist change because the story stops working without them. Whether a woman named Margaret Pomeroy was imprisoned at Barry Pomeroy by a sister named Eleanor, and whether either woman existed in precisely the form the legend describes, is a question the historical record cannot definitively resolve in either direction. The castle was held by the Pomeroy family for approximately 5 centuries, and the internal lives of its inhabitants across that period are not extensively documented. What the legend requires: a family resident in the castle during the medieval period, a domestic space that included a dungeon, and the kind of private violence that leaves no official trace, is consistent with the historical circumstances of the site. What it cannot verify is the specific event. The Blue Lady's story carries a heavier silence on this point, where the White Lady is named and her story is given a shape that history could in principle confirm or contradict. The Blue Lady exists in a more ambiguous relationship to the documented past. The Seymour family held the castle for a century and a half after the Pomeroys departed, and the mansion they built within the old walls passed through a complicated history of occupation, partial completion, and eventual abandonment. The people who lived in those rooms during the Seymour period are, for the most part, names in the documentary record, rather than fully recoverable human presences. The legend's darkness, the infant, the secret, the violence, is attributed to this period in most accounts, but with a looseness about specific dates and persons that the White Lady legend, with its named sisters and its dungeon, does not share. What both legends share is the castle itself, the stone walls, the specific rooms and passages and thresholds that have been the consistent setting for accounts spanning more than 2 centuries. The dungeon entrance and the roofless mansion rooms are not interchangeable in the legend. The White Lady does not appear in the Seymour rooms. The Blue Lady is not reported at the dungeon steps. Each figure has her own geography within the ruins, and that geography has remained stable across the full span of recorded accounts. In the study of traditional ghost lore, this kind of spatial specificity is considered significant, precisely because it is not automatic. Stories told for other purposes, moral instruction, historical memory, community identity, do not inherently attach themselves to specific physical locations with this degree of precision. A story that keeps returning to the same square meters of stone across 2 centuries of independent telling is doing something that not all ghost stories do. It is, in some functional sense, oriented toward a place rather than just told about one. The image of Sir Walter Farquhar crossing the courtyard at Barry Pomeroy on that unspecified afternoon in the early 19th century, notebook likely in hand, watching a figure near the dungeon entrance, and not yet knowing that what he was watching would eventually become part of a record consulted by writers and investigators for the next 200 years. That image has a particular quality of ordinariness. He was a medical professional on a recreational visit to a picturesque ruin in Devon. He was not looking for anything unusual. What he observed was, by his own careful account, observed carefully and without prior expectation. The account he left behind is the account of a man who noticed something and did not know what to do with it, and chose honesty over resolution. The Victorian antiquarian recording local testimony by candlelight in tautness has a different quality, the deliberate, archival quality of someone who knows they are engaged in the preservation of something fragile, something that exists only as long as the people who hold it are alive to tell it. The oral testimony they captured in their notebooks was already, in most cases, not the first-hand account of the witness, but the account of someone who had been told by someone else, or by several other people over several years. The precision that survives into those written records was the precision that the oral tradition had already developed. The location, the gesture, the light, the moment of disappearance, because those were the elements that the people who carried the story had found necessary to preserve. The gesture itself, the arm raised, the hand extended toward the observer, is the detail that has accumulated the most interpretive weight over the years. Accounts that mention it rarely describe it as aggressive. The raised hand is not a hand in a position of threat. It is more ambiguous than that, sitting somewhere between the gesture of someone asking for help and the gesture of someone warning another person away. Both meanings have been attributed to it in different tellings, and the inability to resolve which meaning is correct may be part of what has kept the details so reliably in the story across its long transmission. An ambiguous gesture is harder to dismiss than an unambiguous one. It requires an interpretation from whoever sees it, and different witnesses arrive at the ruins with different things that an ambiguous gesture might be asking them to think about. The Blue Lady's relationship to the unguarded edges of the mansion ruins carries a different kind of interpretive weight. The detail is spatial and physical. She is near the drops, the points where the structure ends and the fall begins, and the response it tends to produce in those who report encountering her is bodily, a withdrawal, a step back from the edge. The accounts do not for the most part describe this as a felt communication from the presence, as though she reached out and pulled the witness away. They describe it as a reflex, a physical response to awareness of her proximity that happens before any deliberate thought. The edge is perceived, and the body moves away from it. Whether this response is to be attributed to something genuinely present in the ruins, or to the perfectly ordinary human tendency to become more aware of physical danger when the attention is focused on one's immediate surroundings, is a question the accounts themselves do not answer. What they record is the sequence, the awareness of a presence, the notice of the drop, the withdrawal. The accounts are consistent on this sequence. They are not consistent on the interpretation. In the roofless rooms of the Seymour mansion, on a still afternoon, with the sky open above the remaining walls and the woodland visible through every window opening, the experience of the space is not obviously one of confinement. It is, if anything, an experience of exposure, the walls around but nothing above, the rooms fully open to whatever weather Devon sends through, the floors beneath the visitor's feet, the rubble of centuries of slow collapse, rather than anything deliberately laid. The mansion was ambitious in its original design, and the ambition is still legible in the surviving stonework, the decorated porch, the mullioned windows that once held glass, the evidence of considerable investment in both the practical and the decorative. The people who commissioned it and built it and lived in it for a century and a half intended it to endure. The ruins endure instead, which is a different thing. The Blue Lady, in the accounts that place her here, inhabits the ruin as it is rather than as it was. She is not reported moving through walls or appearing in spaces that no longer physically exist. She is in the rooms that remain, the ledges of the surviving window openings, the places near the dropped edges where the rubble slopes away from the standing wall. She is in the castle as the visitor encounters it, rather than in some reconstruction of the castle as it once stood. That detail, which appears in the accounts without apparent deliberate intention, gives the legend a particular quality. The Blue Lady is not a figure from the past haunting a building that no longer exists. She is a figure in a ruin that is very much present and very much itself. These two figures, the pale one in the dungeon passage, the blue one in the roofless mansion rooms, have been the dominant presences in Barry Pomeroy's supernatural reputation since the legend first reached written form in the early 19th century. Other accounts have accumulated around the site over the years, other reports of anomalous experience attributed to other causes, other names and interpretations offered by subsequent researchers and visitors. But the White Lady and the Blue Lady have persisted at the center of the tradition in a way that reflects how thoroughly they are embedded in the specific geography of the ruins. They are not interchangeable with other castle ghosts in other Devon locations. They belong to this set of walls, these particular passages and rooms, this specific landscape above the Gatcombe Brook and the South Hams. The dungeon entrance at Barry Pomeroy is still there to walk down to on any afternoon that the castle is open. The passage descends from the courtyard level in the same direction it always has. The air at the bottom is several degrees cooler than the air above. The sound of the world outside recedes in the way that the acoustic properties of any enclosed stone space make it recede. A visitor who stands there in the shade below the curtain wall is standing in the same physical location as every other person who has stood there over the long history of these accounts, and the stone around them is the same stone, and the darkness at the far end of the passage is the same darkness. Margaret Pomeroy's name was attached to this location long before any of the written records that document the attachment. The name came first in the oral tradition of the region, and the written accounts followed, confirming the geography and the gesture and the quality of light. What the earliest written sources found when they went to document the legend was already, by their time, an old story, old enough that its origins could not be traced to a single teller or a single telling, old enough that it had the texture of something that had always been known rather than something recently invented. 2 centuries of separate witnesses in separate visits to the same square meters of ruins, describing the same pale figure in the same location with the same raised hand and the same quality of light, have not resolved the question of what they were seeing. They have instead produced a record of unusual consistency and unusual patience, a record that accumulates quietly, without drama, across a span of time that encompasses significant changes in how the people keeping that record understood the world and what they thought was possible within it. The consistency is the thing that remains when everything else about the accounts is variable. The location, the gesture, the figure standing in the shade at the bottom of the passage, still raising her hand toward whoever looks. The dungeon at Barry Pomeroy Castle is cool even in August. Standing at the entrance to the descending passage, a few steps below the level of the courtyard, the temperature drops by several degrees in the space of a single pace, not the sharp cold of a refrigerator, but the older, denser chill of stone that has not seen direct sunlight in several centuries. The sounds of the woodland above become muffled. The light contracts. The air holds a faint trace of damp, the kind that accumulates over many decades in an enclosed space where moisture seeps slowly through limestone and has nowhere particularly to go. This is the part of the castle where investigators tend to spend their nights. The groups who come to Barry Pomeroy after dark carry a considerable amount of equipment: temperature loggers, electromagnetic field detection meters, audio recorders sensitive enough to capture frequencies at the very edge of what the human ear can process. Some carry devices designed to respond to changes in the electromagnetic environment and translate those changes into audible tones. Others bring video cameras capable of recording in near total darkness. They arrive at dusk when the last day visitors have left and the castle is returned to whatever quiet it maintains for itself, and they set up their equipment in the dungeon and in the roofless rooms of the Seymour Mansion and in the shadow of St. Margaret's Tower, and then they wait. What they document, at least in part, can be measured. The temperature differential between the dungeon and the open courtyard above has been recorded on multiple occasions by separate groups, and the readings are consistent enough to be interesting regardless of how one interprets them. On a mild autumn night, when the courtyard registers around 12 degrees Celsius, the dungeon passage has returned readings several degrees lower, not an extraordinary difference for a sheltered underground space, but one that is held across enough independent sessions to establish itself as a reliable feature of the site, rather than an anomaly of any single visit. The stone at that depth retains cold, the way old stone tends to, absorbing and releasing temperature across a much slower cycle than the open air above. Whether that differential is significant beyond its physical explanation is a question different groups approach differently. Teams affiliated with the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena have conducted structured overnight sessions at the site. Their approach involves the systematic logging of environmental conditions across the ruins, temperature readings taken at regular intervals at multiple fixed points, electromagnetic field measurements recorded in areas that previous visitors have identified as producing anomalous sensations, and audio capture running continuously in locations where electronic voice phenomena, sounds reported to have no immediately obvious source, have been previously noted. The methodology is designed to accumulate data across multiple sessions rather than rely on the impressions of a single visit, and the records they have assembled from Barry Pomeroy represent years of periodic return. The dungeon entrance and the northwest corner of the Seymour Mansion range have produced the most consistent results across those sessions. Temperature drops in both locations have been logged at values that investigators consider significant. Electromagnetic field readings in certain areas of the ruins have registered elevated levels that prompted further investigation. None of this, in isolation, settles the question of what produces those readings. It does establish that the readings occur repeatedly and in the same places, and that establishes something worth continuing to examine. An EMF meter, which is what the electromagnetic field detection devices are usually called, responds to variations in the electromagnetic environment around it. The response is real. The interpretation is where the conversation becomes more complicated. The ruins of Barry Pomeroy contain buried metalwork from structures that no longer stand above ground. The limestone and sandstone of the Devon Hills, in which the castle sits, contain geological irregularities that affect how electromagnetic fields behave in their vicinity. A stone structure of significant age and complexity, with its mix of different materials, different degrees of moisture saturation, different wall thicknesses, and different orientations relative to natural magnetic north, will produce variable readings across its footprint simply because of what it is made from and how it has been built. Skeptical researchers looking at EMF data from haunted locations make this point consistently and make it well. A reading that varies from one part of a ruin to another does not require a non-physical explanation, It may not even require much of an explanation at all. The paranormal investigators acknowledge this. The more methodologically careful among them do not present elevated EMF readings as evidence of anything beyond the readings themselves. What they note is that the locations producing elevated readings are also the locations that generate the most consistent witness reports, and that the coincidence of those two things is worth noting even if it cannot yet be explained. The team sets up and waits. The temperature logger on the dungeon floor continues its patient work. The brook in the ravine is faintly audible, a soft and continuous sound that moves through the stone and the earth, and arrives in the dungeon as something barely louder than silence. There is a proposal in acoustic research that may be relevant to what happens to people in spaces like the Barry Pomeroy dungeon. Wind passing over and through complex stone structures can generate sound waves at frequencies below the lower limit of human hearing, below approximately 20 hertz, in the range that physical vibration rather than audible sound is the primary effect. The body detects these waves through sensation rather than through the ears. The effect on physiology is subtle but measurable. At certain frequencies in that range, particularly around 18 to 19 hertz, experimental exposure has been associated with feelings of discomfort and the perception of peripheral movement, the sense that something is present just outside direct vision. The sensation is not imagined, in the sense that it has a real physical cause, but the cause has nothing to do with presence of any kind. It is air and frequency and the particular architecture of a human perceptual system that is very good at detecting motion and not always precise about what is generating the detection signal. The proposal is not specific to Barry Pomeroy. It has been applied to haunted locations more broadly by researchers, studying why certain old buildings, particularly those with complex internal geometry and significant exposure to prevailing winds, seem to generate anomalous perceptual experiences in visitors with unusual consistency. Barry Pomeroy sits in a narrow wooded valley with the Gatcombe Brook below and a consistent pattern of airflow through the gorge. Its stone passages, particularly the dungeon access, funnel air in ways that a simpler, more open structure would not. Whether the geometry of the castle produces infrasound at the relevant frequencies has not, to the available record, been formally measured at the site. The proposal remains a proposal rather than a finding. It is nonetheless a thoughtful one. What the researchers studying haunted locations tend to agree on is that the phenomenon worth explaining is not the ghost, it is the experience. The reports of anomalous sensations at Barry Pomeroy, the feeling of being observed, the peripheral movement, the drop in temperature that seems to arrive without the usual explanation of a draught, are real reports made by real people, and the majority of those people were not expecting to have an unusual experience when they had one. That is worth taking seriously, regardless of what the experience is eventually attributed to. The investigator sitting in the dungeon at 2 in the morning is not, in most cases, frightened. That is worth noting, because the popular image of paranormal investigation leans heavily on performed alarm. The serious practitioners describe something more like patient attention, the specific state of someone who has set up conditions for a thing to happen and is now waiting, with as much calm as the hour and the setting permit, to see whether it does. The temperature logger runs. The audio recorder runs. The electromagnetic meter sits on the flagstones and registers whatever the flagstones have to offer. The investigator sits and listens to the castle, because that is what investigation at this level mostly is, listening carefully to a very old place and trying to distinguish between what the place is producing and what the observer is bringing to it. Both are active, Both are real. The difficulty, and it is a genuine one, is separating them. The Gatcombe Brook is always audible in the dungeon, faintly. That fact alone is interesting. The castle sits 30 or 40 feet above the brook at its nearest point, with solid stone and compacted earth between them, and the sound still arrives. It comes through the rock rather than through the air. The limestone transmits it. The frequency is low, a continuous rushing that the body receives as much as the ears do, and it is present in the recordings from every session held in the dungeon, regardless of season or the volume of water in the stream. It is a fundamental feature of the acoustic environment in that part of the castle, and any analysis of audio recordings made there has to account for it as part of the baseline. Electronic voice phenomena sessions, the practice of playing audio recordings back slowly and listening for patterns that might constitute voices or other intentional sounds, have been conducted in the dungeon by multiple teams over multiple years. The recordings exist. They have been shared, compared, and listened to by people with no investment in what they contain. The anomalous sounds that investigators have identified within them are almost always quiet and brief. A tone, a syllable, something that, when isolated and amplified, sounds to some listeners like a word. Audio analysts who approach the same recordings without prior knowledge of the investigative context tend to reach different conclusions. They hear wind noise moving through the stone passage at a frequency that varies with air pressure. They hear the echo properties of the dungeon walls, adding overtones to sounds that entered the space with a simpler acoustic signature. They hear the brook at the bottom of its frequency range, arriving through the stone in a rhythm that has no particular pattern, but produces one when the human auditory system applies its formidable pattern recognition capability to it. Auditory pareidolia is the term for the specific tendency to hear voices or words in continuous noise. It is a real perceptual phenomenon, well documented in laboratory settings, and it is particularly active in conditions of low light, mild fatigue, and heightened attention, all of which describe a dungeon at 2 in the morning rather precisely. The ear is not deceiving the mind in any simple sense. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do, which is find signals in noise. The difficulty is that the signals it finds are not always signals. Sometimes they are the brook, sometimes they are the wind, sometimes they are the castle itself, resonating in the particular way that a dense stone structure resonates, producing harmonics in the air that carry faint resemblances to human phonemes, for the same reason that clouds sometimes resemble faces. None of this makes the experience less interesting. It may, in its way, make it more so. English Heritage, which manages Barry Pomeroy Castle and is responsible for its interpretation and conservation, occupies a carefully calibrated position on all of this. Its guidebooks describe the ghost legends in some detail, presenting them as part of the castle's documented cultural history, rather than as claims about objective events. The interpretation panels near the dungeon entrance acknowledge that the castle has a significant paranormal reputation, and that the stories attached to it are old and persistent. They do not conclude from this that the stories are literally true. They do not conclude that they are entirely without basis. They hold both possibilities with the same steady, publicly measured hand. That positioning is more thoughtful than it might appear. English Heritage is a body responsible for the preservation and public presentation of historic sites across England, and its relationship to the more colorful aspects of those sites' histories is necessarily complex. Barry Pomeroy's ghost legends are genuinely part of its history, and they have shaped the castle's cultural significance. They have brought visitors to a ruin in a South Devon valley that might otherwise remain largely unknown beyond the county. To ignore them would be a kind of dishonesty about what the place is and what it means to the people who visit it. To endorse them as literal supernatural fact would be a different kind of dishonesty. The middle course, which is the one the organization has chosen, involves presenting the legends with the care and seriousness that significant pieces of cultural heritage deserve, without making claims that neither the evidence nor the organization's own mission would support. The commercial side of that position is also worth acknowledging because it is part of the picture. English Heritage operates overnight paranormal investigation events at Barry Pomeroy, ticketed sessions in which groups are given access to the castle after dark, with the specific purpose of conducting the kind of investigation the site's reputation invites. Those events are popular, they sell out. They generate the kind of visitor engagement that a roofless ruin in a Devon valley is unlikely to generate through historical interpretation alone. The castle's reputation as a haunted place is, in a concrete, practical sense, one of its assets, and managing that asset while maintaining the organization's credibility requires holding exactly the kind of open, non-committal position that the interpretation materials reflect. The ghost tour group that moves through the courtyard on an October evening, their guide pausing at the dungeon entrance, their torches cutting pale shapes in the dark, they are part of the castle's life now, just as genuinely as the jackdaws nesting in the curtain wall or the ferns growing from the mortar joints of the mansion facade. They are a form of the castle's ongoing meaning in the world, an active transmission of the stories that have attached themselves to the site and declined to leave. Whether they find what they are looking for is less important, perhaps, than the fact of their finding themselves here, in this specific old place, in the dark, listening. There is something that investigation teams at Barry Pomeroy tend to notice, regardless of what their instruments record. The castle is exceptionally quiet, not silent. The brook never stops, and the woodland has its own constant low register of sound, and the wind moves through the open window openings of the mansion with a tone that varies depending on the speed and direction of the air. But the human noise that fills most places is absent. No traffic, no machinery, no conversation from adjacent rooms. The ruin sits in its valley in a state of auditory sparseness that is relatively rare in the contemporary English landscape, and the effect of that sparseness on people who spend several hours inside it is notable. They become more attentive. Their perceptual sensitivity increases in the specific way that sensitivity always increases when the background level of stimulation drops. They begin to hear things they would not hear in a louder environment. Whether any of those things are paranormal in origin is a question the instruments are meant to address. That the experience of hearing them is real is not in dispute. The temperature in the dungeon at 3 a.m, if the night has been still and dry, tends to hold at whatever value it reached after the first hour of the session. Stone at that depth reaches equilibrium with the air inside the passage and then stays there. The logger on the flagstones records a flat line, a sequence of identical readings separated by the programmed interval, a picture of thermal stillness. Above, in the open courtyard, the temperature has dropped further as the night has advanced and the sky has continued to radiate heat upward. The differential between dungeon and courtyard has widened. The dungeon is now warmer than the open air outside, by a degree or two, the reverse of what a casual visitor might expect from a space that feels so much colder when they first descend. Perception and measurement do not always agree. That is one of the things a temperature logger is for. The electromagnetic readings in the northwest corner of the Seymour Mansion range are harder to account for on the basis of architecture alone. The corner in question does not sit above any known buried metalwork, or at least not any that the records show. The geological substrate in that part of the site has not been formally surveyed at the level of detail that would allow a confident attribution of anomalous readings to natural causes. The readings have been recorded by separate teams using separate instruments, which reduces the likelihood that they reflect a calibration error in any single device. They remain, in the technical sense, unexplained, not in the sense that they could not be explained, but in the sense that the explanation for them has not yet been established. Unexplained readings in a ruined castle in a Devon valley are not in themselves evidence of anything beyond the readings. That is the position that rigorous investigation requires. The readings are documented, their cause is not established. Those two facts sit alongside each other without resolution, because honest inquiry does not resolve things before the evidence justifies resolution. The investigators who work at Barry Pomeroy regularly are, as a group, comfortable with that lack of resolution. The ones who persist through multiple sessions tend to be the ones who have found that patience with ambiguity is more productive in this kind of work than certainty. They come back not because they are expecting to confirm what they believe, but because the site continues to produce material that rewards attention, and because the process of attending to it carefully, in the dark, with instruments running, and the brook below, and the castle's particular acoustic signature surrounding the session, is itself a kind of experience worth having. Whether or not anything in the dungeon at Barry Pomeroy is what the ghost legends say it is, the dungeon is an extraordinary place to spend a night. The stone is very old. The cold is the real physical cold of deep limestone in a sheltered valley. The sounds are the sounds of a living landscape, the water and the wind and the small movements of nocturnal animals in the woodland above, all of it filtered through hundreds of feet of rock and centuries of accumulated stone. The darkness, when the torches are off, is the particular darkness of an underground space, not quite total, because there is always some faint light arriving from the courtyard above, but close enough to total that the eye begins to work differently, searching for boundaries that are not quite visible. The acoustic properties of the dungeon are significant and consistently underappreciated. The passage is roughly rectangular in cross-section, and the smooth stone surfaces at its sides and ceiling reflect sound in ways that a more irregularly shaped space would not. A voice spoken at one end of the passage arrives at the other end, with its consonants slightly smeared and its vowels extended. A sound introduced from outside the passage, the brook, the wind in the trees above the gorge, arrives having passed through so many refractive transitions that its original character has been significantly altered. The result is a space where the relationship between a sound and its apparent source is genuinely difficult to establish by ear alone. Investigators working in it are contending not just with what sounds are present, but with what the space itself does to sounds before they reach the listener. That complexity is not an argument against the investigation. It is an argument for it being done carefully, with an appreciation for what the environment contributes to the evidence before any claim is made about what the evidence contains. The careful investigators understand this. They spend considerable time on each session establishing the baseline, documenting what the dungeon sounds like when nothing unusual is happening, so that they have a reference point against which to measure what happens later in the night. The baseline is always interesting. That is perhaps the most consistent finding across all the sessions at Barry Pomeroy across all the teams, across all the instruments. The castle in its ordinary state, with no claim being made about what it contains, produces an environment that rewards attention. The temperature differential is real. The acoustic signature is distinctive. The electromagnetic environment is variable in ways that have not been fully characterized. The sounds that move through the stone from the brook below are present even in deep silence. These are not supernatural findings. They are the findings of a very old stone structure in a particular landscape with a particular geology, a particular topography, and a particular relationship between the enclosed spaces of its ruins and the open air of the valley around them. They are, taken together, a description of a place that is genuinely unusual without needing any further claim made on its behalf. The investigation, in its patient and instrument-laden way, is partly a documentation of that unusualness. The readings and the logs and the audio files accumulate a picture of the castle as a physical environment, and that picture is itself worth having, regardless of whether it also contains something else. By 4 in the morning, the serious investigators are usually still. The initial round of active investigation, the structured sessions with specific protocols, the questions addressed to empty rooms, the careful monitoring of instrument readings, has given way to something quieter. They sit with their equipment and they listen. The castle listens back, in the sense that all very old stone places seem to listen back, with the patient indifference of something that has been present far longer than any of the people moving through it. The dungeon holds its temperature. The brook continues. The woodland above the gorge is very dark and very still, with only the occasional small sound of something moving in the leaf litter to indicate that anything living remains active at that hour. The audio recorder runs. Its memory fills slowly with the sound of the castle being itself, the stone, the water, the faint wind, the irreducible acoustic character of a space that has been sealed from the world for centuries and opened again only gradually. Whether that record contains anything beyond what those ordinary causes can account for is a question that will be addressed in the morning when the recordings are played back and the investigators lean close to their laptops and listen with the same patient care they brought to the night. For whatever is in the audio that was not in the baseline, sometimes there is something, a sound without an obvious source, a tone that does not match the characteristic frequency of the wind or the water or the echo of the stone. These instances are noted, clipped, filed, and passed on to people with the relevant expertise to examine them further. Sometimes those experts identify a physical cause that the investigative team had not considered. Sometimes they cannot, and the clip joins the collection of material that remains, for now, without a complete explanation. The collection grows slowly, over years, as teams return and sessions accumulate, and the instruments record what they record. It is not a dramatic process. It does not resolve in revelation. It is the ordinary work of patient inquiry into a question that resists easy answers, conducted in an extraordinary setting, in the dark, with the old stone around, and the old water below, and the old sky somewhere above the roofless walls. That the question has not been answered yet is not, in itself, a failure of the inquiry. Some questions at some places have been asked for a very long time, and the asking itself becomes part of what the place is, a layer of accumulated attention added to the layers of accumulated stone and moss, and centuries, all of it held together by the valley's particular grip on the things that settle into it. The Gatcombe Brook in the ravine below the castle is constant. It was there before the castle. It ran through the valley while the Norman lords held their manor, and while the Pomeroys built their walls, and while the Seymours raised their Renaissance windows toward the Devon sky, and while the last residents packed their possessions and departed, leaving the rooms to the air and the rain and the small creatures that moved into the spaces the people left behind. It ran while the roof timbers fell, and while the floors collapsed inward, and while the ivy began its slow, patient work on the mortar joints of the outer wall. It runs now, at whatever hour the listener encounters it, carrying cold water from the Devon hills down through the limestone gorge and away into the wider valley below. It carries no particular story. It makes no claim. It is simply continuous. The way water through a permanent landscape is continuous, present before the first stone was laid, and likely to be present after the last one falls, indifferent to what has happened on the ridge above it, and entirely absorbed in the simple work of running downhill, in the dark, as it always has. The castle above that water is in its way the same. It holds what it holds, centuries of occupation, the stories that have attached themselves to its walls, the readings logged in its dungeons by people with instruments and notebooks, the questions asked of its empty rooms at 3 a.m. by people sitting on its cold floors with recorders running. It holds all of this without distinguishing between them, the way old stone holds everything it is given, with the same slow patience, the same gradual accumulation, the same willingness to retain what settles into it and remain quiet about what it means. The session ends as the light begins to change in the courtyard above the dungeon entrance. Not sunrise, not yet, but the first intimation of it. A slight reduction in the density of the dark that the experienced investigator learns to notice after enough nights in ruins. The equipment is gathered, the loggers are collected, their memory full of the night's temperature record. The audio devices are stopped and labeled. The readings are noted in the log. Everything is packed carefully, because the instruments are expensive, and because carefulness is in this work the appropriate mode. The dungeon is left exactly as it was found. The cold air will hold there until the afternoon sun raises the temperature in the courtyard sufficiently to begin drawing it upward. The brook will continue below. The castle will be open to day visitors in a few hours, and they will walk through the courtyard and pause at the dungeon entrance and feel the drop in temperature and perhaps linger there for a moment, held by something they might not be able to name, the specific quality of that enclosed, cool, old, quietly resonant space, which has the same effect on a summer afternoon that it has in the deep of a November night, because the effect has nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the place itself. That effect, whatever its ultimate explanation, is the thing the instruments are trying to document. And the patient, accumulating record of sessions held at Barry Pomeroy over many years is, whatever else it may contain, a careful and sustained attempt to listen to a very old place with sufficient attention to hear what it is actually saying, what the stone holds, what the air carries, what the castle returns in the particular acoustic dark of its enclosed passages to the people who come there in the quiet hours and ask. The arch of St. Margaret's Tower is wide enough for a cart and old enough that the stone at its crown has been worn smooth by 6 centuries of Devon weather. Passing through it, the air changes. Not dramatically, there is no sudden cold, no theatrical drop in temperature, but in the way that air changes when it has been enclosed for a very long time. The smell is old stone and damp earth and something green, the particular green smell of moss that has been growing in the same damp corner since before anyone now living was born. The sound changes too. The woodland behind, with its constant quiet movement of birds and wind and leaves, falls back. The courtyard ahead opens out. For a moment, the arch holds both worlds at once, the world outside and the world within, and then the stone releases its visitor into the space beyond, and the castle receives them in its usual, unhurried way. Barry Pomeroy keeps that quality throughout. Whatever hour a person enters, whatever season, the castle has an atmosphere of patient enclosure, not confinement. Nothing so narrow as that, but the specific feeling of a place that has been absorbing weather and light and silence for so long that it has become quite good at it. The walls are not defensive in the way that a living fortress is defensive. They stand the way very old things stand, because nothing has yet been strong enough to bring them down, and because the slow work of Devon rain and Devon frost, while constant, has not quite been enough either. The castle and the elements have been at this long negotiation for 3 centuries of ruin, and both sides have learned to be patient. St. Margaret's Tower, which forms the main gatehouse of the curtain wall, stands largely intact to its original height. Both of its flanking towers retain much of their dressed stonework, and the entrance passage between them still shows, clearly and precisely, the grooves cut into the stone on either side to receive the portcullis mechanism. The grooves run straight and deep, each one cut with the seriousness of people who needed to be serious about such things, and they remain as exact now as the day they were made. The portcullis itself is gone. The mechanism it rode in is gone. But the stone keeps the record of it the way stone keeps most records, without emphasis, without sentimentality, simply as a fact about the shape of itself. Standing in the entrance passage, with one hand against the wall, the groove is at shoulder height and the width of a thumb, and the stone around it is cool and faintly rough with the particular texture of medieval ashlar that has been out in the weather for longer than the current geological survey has been kept. The passage is perhaps 8 feet long. It frames the courtyard ahead in a rectangle of open sky and green stone, and on a clear afternoon in summer, the light comes through that rectangle with the directness of something that has been waiting for the angle to be exactly right, and fills the inner end of the passage with a warmth that makes the walls on either side glow faintly amber. The dressed stone catches it differently from the rougher sections. There are 2 colors in it at once, the gray of the outer face and the warm red gold beneath, and in that quality of afternoon light, the stone looks almost as if it still remembers being warm inside the earth before it was cut. The courtyard itself is grass now, close cropped by the management work that keeps it passable for visitors, and the grass is the vivid, unserious green of places that receive both good rainfall and good light. The curtain wall runs around it in its broad D shape, and within that enclosure, the ruins of the Seymour mansion rise against the sky in a way that never quite resolves itself into a simple impression. The walls are too tall to feel ruined in the diminished sense of the word. They are too present. In places they survive to 3 stories, the full height of what was once an ambitious domestic building, and the window openings at each level are still precisely themselves, mullioned openings in the warm Devon limestone, their stone tracery, worn but legible, framing not glass now but open sky, and the woodland beyond, which is visible through them in long rectangles of green and blue that change with every cloud and every hour of the day. The entrance porch of the Seymour mansion stands at the east end of the main range, and it is one of the places where the ambition of the original building is still most directly readable in the stonework. The decorated string courses that run horizontally across its face are carved with the specific confidence of craftspeople working for someone who expected the best and was paying for it. The carving is not elaborate by the standards of the great Elizabethan and Jacobean houses further east, but it is precise, and it has a quality of formal seriousness that reads clearly even now, even open to the sky, even with 3 centuries of lichen growing softly in the carved recesses. Someone wanted this porch to announce something. It still does, in its quiet way, though what it announces now is not the power of the family who ordered it, but the specific persistence of good stone, which outlasts the intentions it was shaped to express, and simply continues. The Devon limestone the castle is built from comes in 2 registers of color, a warm red-brown and a cooler gray, and both are present throughout the fabric of the walls in proportions that vary with the age and function of different sections. The medieval curtain wall tends toward the gray, the ashlar courses of the gatehouse flanking towers, showing that cool blue-gray that Devon limestone acquires after long exposure to Atlantic weather. The Seymour Mansion range is warmer, the red in it more evident, particularly in the lower courses where the stone is still partly sheltered from the direct rain by the angle of the walls above. Where the two meet, where Seymour period additions join the older fabric, the color change is visible as a quiet seam. The history of the building's 2 main phases, written in the stone's own pigment, without any further explanation required. There is a particular stretch of the curtain wall on the northern side of the enclosure where the dressed face of the original ashlar gives way, within perhaps 2 arms' lengths, to a section of deep green moss. The transition is not gradual in the way one might expect. The dressed stone is smooth and dry, and then quite suddenly it is soft and wet and colonized, the moss so thick in the angle where the wall meets a slight change in grade that it holds its own moisture, even in dry weeks. Passing a hand along the wall from the smooth section into the moss is a particular kind of tactile experience. The stone is cool and precise, the moss is cooler and softer, yielding slightly under pressure and releasing the faint green smell of itself. And it is possible to press a palm flat against it and feel the slight dampness come through in a few seconds, the wall offering up what it has collected from the last rainfall or the last morning's dew. The moss does not distinguish between medieval ashlar and Renaissance limestone. It colonizes whatever angle and moisture and shade it requires, and the age of the stone beneath it is not something it considers. The walls of the mansion range are covered in ivy across their upper sections, and in summer the growth is dense enough that significant stretches of stonework become invisible behind it, present only as a hard surface behind the leaves. The ivy clings to the wall face with its particular fastening method, each tendril finding a mortar joint or a slight irregularity in the dressed stone surface and anchoring to it with the specific unhurried determination of a plant that has no particular deadline. And some of the ivy growth at Barry Pomeroy is old enough to have stems at its base as thick as a hand's width, woody and gnarled and permanent looking, the same individual plant that was a thin stem 20 or 30 years ago, now supporting a spread of growth across 20 feet of wall. The plant has, in a certain sense, become part of the wall's structural reality, not load-bearing, nothing so architectural as that, but present enough that its removal would leave the wall visibly changed, the pale scars of former attachment points scattered across the stone for years afterward. From certain positions in the courtyard in summer, when the ivy is at its fullest, and the trees within the enclosure walls are in complete leaf, the view upward is almost entirely green. The window openings in the upper story of the mansion range frame sections of sky, but the wall between them is green, and the sky beyond is often the particular soft blue-gray of a Devon summer afternoon when the light is good, but the clouds are present, and the whole effect, walls of green and stone rising to that pale sky, through rectangles of open window, has the quality of a place that has made its peace with whatever had been planned for it, and settled into something easier and longer lasting. There is a fern growing from a mortar joint approximately 20 feet up the east face of the mansion wall. It is not a large fern. The joint gives it perhaps 3 inches of soil depth to work with, and the position is exposed enough that it takes the full force of any westerly wind that moves through the courtyard below. The fern has been there long enough that its root system has expanded the joint slightly, the mortar crumbling away from it over years of seasonal freeze and thaw, and the gap it occupies is now a small but legible notch in the wall's face. In summer, the fronds extend to perhaps 1.5 feet in length, curving outward and downward with the particular elegance of fern fronds, which always seem to have found exactly the most graceful arrangement available to them. In winter, the fronds die back, and the joint holds only the rootstock and the dark compressed earth around it. In spring, the new fronds emerge, curled tight and pale green, the specific unfurling that ferns do in the particular patient way they have done it since long before there were walls for them to grow from. On a day with any wind at all, the fronds move in ways the stone around them does not, their motion giving scale to a breeze that would otherwise be invisible from the courtyard below. The woodland on the northern and eastern sides of the enclosure is mixed, oak and ash and hazel in its main structure, with a dense understory of ferns and mosses and ivy on the woodland floor, and in certain seasons a brief spectacular coverage of flowering plants that takes over the ground layer completely before the canopy closes overhead and reduces the available light. In April, the bluebells are present throughout this woodland, and on a windless day in mid-April, the scent carries into the courtyard itself, arriving with the same gentle constancy as the sound of the brook below. The bluebells grow right to the base of the curtain wall on the woodland side, their stems rising from the same soil that the wall's foundations have been set in for 6 centuries, and where the wall has any slight gap or lowering of its coping, the flowers appear on the interior side as well, extending a few feet into the courtyard before the mown grass begins and the conditions change. There is nothing arranged about it. The wall did not plan to have bluebells at its foot, and the bluebells did not choose a castle. They simply occupy the ground that has the right combination of shade and moisture and soil depth, and the wall is simply where the woodland meets its boundary. And in April, the two share a color scheme, the soft gray of old Devon limestone and the blue that is almost purple in the shade and almost blue in open light that no one designed and no one needs to draw attention to. The wood anemones come earlier, in March, when the trees have not yet leafed out and the light falls full through the bare canopy onto the woodland floor. They are smaller than the bluebells and grow in denser clusters, their white flowers held above the ground on stems thin enough to move in a breath of air, and they cover the woodland floor in sections that shift from year to year as the available light shifts with the growth and occasional fall of trees above them. In a mild March, the anemones are at their fullest, precisely when the stonework of the castle is at its most visible, the ivy not yet fully leafed, the deciduous trees still bare, the mansion walls standing clear against a pale sky. The contrast is not one that presents itself as a composition. It is simply what March looks like here, the white flowers and the gray-brown stone, and the bare tree limbs and the sky, all present at once without apparent awareness of each other, the botanical year and the architectural ruin proceeding simultaneously in the usual way. The sound of the Gatcombe Brook is audible from most parts of the site, and it changes across the seasons in a way that gives the castle's ambient sound a different quality depending on when a visitor arrives. In late summer, after a dry spell, The brook runs low, and the sound it makes is a gentle murmur, continuous but uninsistent, rising to the castle from the ravine in the same way that background sounds rise from a distance, present enough to register, not insistent enough to demand attention. After the first significant autumn rainfall, the character of the sound changes. The brook carries more water, and what had been a murmur becomes something fuller and more various, a rush that has cadence to it, quieter moments followed by louder ones as the water negotiates the boulders and tree roots of the ravine floor. In November, after sustained wet weather, the brook can be loud enough to carry clearly through the bare woodland and into the courtyard above, a constant running sound that gives the whole castle site a particular quality of aliveness. Nothing quiet, nothing still, the water moving continuously, whether or not anyone is present to hear it. In winter, when the leaf cover is gone and the light falls at its lowest angle through the trees, the ruins are most fully visible from the valley below. The curtain wall rises above the bare tree line, and the mansion walls stand within it, and from the lane approaching through the woodland, the castle appears at a turn in the path as something stark and vertical above a horizontal mass of bare gray branches. The stone is darker in winter, the moisture content higher, and the color that had been warm amber and red gold in summer sunlight becomes something more soberly gray in the low winter light. The moss on the lower walls is greener in winter. Paradoxically, the reduced competition from the ivy and the higher moisture producing its richest color, precisely when everything around it is at its most monochrome. The ferns that grow from the wall joints are dead back to their rootstocks, and the ivy that covers the upper mansion walls has lost none of its coverage. Ivy is evergreen, its leaves present through every season, which means that in winter, when all the deciduous growth has withdrawn, the ivy becomes more visible rather than less, the dark green of it covering significant sections of the upper walls, in a way the summer's general greenery had somewhat obscured. At dawn, in any season, the mansion ruins have a particular quality that the middle of the day does not quite replicate. The light comes from the east, and the east-facing walls of the Seymour Range receive it first, the window openings in those walls beginning to glow before the courtyard below has properly lightened. In autumn and winter, mist rises from the Gatcombe Brook in the ravine and drifts upward through the woodland to the castle's lower courses, and there are mornings when the base of the curtain wall is in mist while the upper section of the mansion walls is already in low sunlight, the building existing simultaneously in two different qualities of light and air. The mullioned window openings in the upper story catch the early light in their stone sills, each sill becoming a narrow horizontal strip of warmth against the cool wall face, and the light in them changes as the sun rises, moving in the way that light in fixed openings always moves, which is to say that it is the world moving and the openings are still, holding their rectangles of air at the same coordinates they have held them for 4 centuries, while the light travels through. The stonework of the castle holds the record of every kind of weather that has come off the Atlantic since the walls were standing. The surfaces tell different stories depending on their orientation and exposure. The south-facing faces of the curtain wall, which take the most direct sunlight and the most drying wind, are lighter in color and more cleanly surfaced. The biological growth on them limited to the thin, dark crust of crustose lichen that colonizes exposed limestone across the whole site. The north-facing and sheltered surfaces are another matter entirely. The moss colonies on these faces are thick and varied, running from the deep emerald of the wettest areas to the drier, paler green of sections that get occasional sun, and between the moss patches there are sections of foliose lichen in gray-green and pale yellow, growing so slowly across the stone surface that their current position represents decades or centuries of patient expansion from whatever spore first landed on a suitable surface and found it adequate. The lichens are not dramatic. They are a kind of very slow writing on the stone, patient and undramatic, and largely unread. The entrance porch of the Seymour Mansion, standing at the east end of the main residential range, is open to the sky in the way that most of the mansion is open to the sky. The ceiling that would have covered it is long gone, removed by time and weather and the gradual dismantling that happened to abandoned buildings in the 18th century when their materials were wanted elsewhere. What remains is the porch's side walls and the decorated stonework of its facade. And through the missing ceiling, the afternoon light falls directly onto the paved floor of the porch, or onto whatever grass and moss have colonized the floor in the areas where the original paving has heaved or been removed. The decorated string courses on the facade face outward into the courtyard, and a person standing in the courtyard looking at them is looking at stonework that was designed to be read from that angle, the formal public face of a grand domestic building, its carved details, legible even now in the right light, even with centuries of weathering softening their edges. The carving is not fully legible in the way it once was, but enough remains that the original intention is still present, the way an old handwriting remains legible when not all the letters are fully formed. Late afternoon at Barry Pomeroy is the hour when the light through the arch of St. Margaret's Tower does its most precise work. The sun, descending in the western sky, aligns itself at a certain point with the axis of the entrance passage, and the light comes through the arch and projects a rectangle of gold onto the courtyard floor beyond. The rectangle is clear-edged and warm, distinctly bounded from the cooler light of the shaded courtyard around it, and as the afternoon continues, the rectangle moves, not quickly, but visibly, if watched over a quarter of an hour, the leading edge advancing across the courtyard stone and the shape changing as the angle of the light changes. This is not a designed effect. No one arranged the arch to do this. It is simply geometry, the fixed opening and the moving sun producing their predictable result each clear afternoon, as they have done on every clear afternoon since the arch was built. The portcullis grooves on either side of the passage are in shadow for most of this display, the light not quite reaching them at the angles it finds in late afternoon, but their presence is still there to touch, cool, and exact, and cut by hands that had no idea what the arch would be framing after them. The ivy on the curtain wall in late afternoon is a different proposition from the ivy at midday. The direct light gives way to a lower, more directional illumination that catches the surface of the leaves differently, bringing out the gloss of them and making visible the slight dimensional variation in the mass of growth that midday's flatter light had smoothed away. There are places where the ivy has grown thick enough to form something like a topography of its own over the wall face beneath. Peaks and hollows in the growth that have nothing to do with the underlying stonework, and everything to do with the way the ivy has found its own internal logic of branching and weight over decades. In a light breeze, this surface moves, not all at once, not as a single motion, but in slow traveling waves that pass across the face of the wall from the direction of the wind, each wave moving 10,000 leaves in a slow coordinated turn that is briefly visible as a change in the surface before the stillness returns. The motion is quiet. The leaves turning catch the light slightly differently as they move, and the ripple of different brightness travels across the wall, face in the same direction as the breeze, slow and continuous, and entirely without urgency. The overall effect of a late afternoon in summer at Barry Pomeroy is one of accumulated warmth and patient stillness. The stone has been absorbing heat all day and releases it slowly as the light shifts. The woodland on the northern side is in full voice through the afternoon. Wood pigeons and assorted smaller birds present at various distances in the canopy, the brook continuing in the ravine, and that sound is always present, but never foregrounded, never demanding, simply running beneath the visual experience of the walls and the windows and the light on the stone. A person sitting in the courtyard on a clear summer afternoon, back against the curtain wall, could stay there for a long time without requiring anything to happen. The castle does not insist. It does not perform. It continues in the particular way of very old places that have long since released any expectation that they will be noticed and have found in that release a kind of settled ease. The mortar joints in the curtain wall vary considerably in their condition and depth. Some are flush with the surrounding stone face, packed tight by centuries of compression and the natural movement of lime mortar over time. Others have opened somewhat, the original mortar receding from the surface as it has weathered and crumbled, leaving shallow channels between the stone courses that collect rainfall and support the growth of whatever small plants find them suitable. The deepest of these recessed joints hold a small world, the microenvironment of a mortar joint in a damp Devon castle, being surprisingly rich in biological terms, with moss, lichen, small flowering plants, and the occasional fern root, all sharing a space perhaps an inch wide and 2 or 3 inches deep. Running a fingernail along the surface of the wall, passing over joint after joint, the variation is constant: hard flush mortar, soft recessed mortar, moss that yields to pressure, lichen that resists it, smooth stone, roughened stone, the occasional projecting edge, where frost has worked along a fracture and the surface has begun to separate. The wall is never the same surface twice. The grass in the courtyard is mown on a schedule that keeps it short enough to walk on comfortably and reveals the underlying topography of the courtyard floor, which is uneven in ways that centuries of occupation and subsequent abandonment have made various and unpredictable. There are slight undulations that may represent buried features, the remnants of floors, of drainage channels, of structures that stood within the castle's walls and were leveled without being removed entirely. The grass does not care about this. It grows at the same rate across the humps and the hollows, adapting to the variation in drainage and soil depth that the topography produces, slightly lusher in the damper hollows, and slightly tougher on the better drained rises. The management work that keeps it short keeps it consistently green through the summer, and in early morning, with dew still on it, the courtyard grass has the particular silver-green quality of well-watered turf in low horizontal light, each blade holding its small bead of moisture until the warmth arrives and releases it. On an overcast day in autumn, the castle takes on yet another quality, the diffuse light that comes off an overcast Devon sky, mild and gray and directionless, removes the strong shadows that give the walls their most dramatic texture on sunny days, and replaces them with an even illumination that makes the surface detail of the stonework more uniformly visible. Every dressed course, every mortar joint, every patch of lichen is equally present under this flat light, none of it privileged by the direction of the sun. The colors shift too. The warm ambers and reds recede in the absence of direct sunlight, and what the overcast shows is the cooler palette underneath, the blue-gray of the oldest ashlar sections and the darker tones of the damp stone where recent rainfall has moved through the wall. The woodland beyond the curtain wall is at its fullest color in October, the oaks running from green to yellow to copper, the ash already bare, the hazel a pale gold, and the curtain wall frames sections of that color in the openings above its coping. Adding to the castle's display, an element it did not build into itself, but which arrives reliably every year. The brook in the ravine is not visible from within the castle walls. It is audible, continuously, its sound carrying upward through the trees in all seasons, but the ravine that contains it is below the southern edge of the castle's ridge, and the vegetation between is dense enough that the water remains out of sight. This is part of what gives Barry Pomeroy its particular quality of enclosure. The castle is surrounded by woodland on most sides. The woodland falls away into the ravine to the south, and the ravine contains its own continuous presence in the form of the brook, audible but invisible, running below whatever is happening above it. The effect is of a place held within its own acoustics, the brook providing a constant background that remains constant regardless of season, time of day, or the number of people present. When the courtyard is empty and quiet, the brook is the dominant sound. When visitors are present, the brook continues beneath the human sounds of footsteps and voices. When the wind is up and moving the woodland canopy, the brook continues beneath the wind. It is simply always there, below everything, steady and indifferent and cold. There is a view from inside the castle that is not an architectural view, not the formal compositions through the arched gateway or the framed rectangles of the mullioned openings, but the view through the eastern gable wall of the mansion range, where the wall has lost most of its upper section, and the opening is not a window, but a gap, irregular at its top, and still partially lined by the courses that have not yet fallen. Through this gap, the hillside to the east is visible, a long slope of mixed woodland rising away from the ravine, and in clear weather the far side of that slope catches afternoon light in a way that makes the beech trees on it glow a particular rich gold that is visible as a brightness through the gap, even from the courtyard side. The gap in the wall was not designed as a viewpoint. It became one by default, as a result of the same gradual losses that opened the roofless rooms to the sky, and the view through it, the irregular gap of old stone, the slope of woodland beyond. The gold of late afternoon light on the beaches is the view that 3 centuries of emptiness made available by taking away what had stood there before. As the afternoon light fades from the courtyard and the walls begin to cool, the sounds of the woodland become, if anything, more present. The bird song of the day shifts to the quieter movements of late afternoon, a wood pigeon settling somewhere above the north wall, small birds moving through the understory below the curtain wall, the brook continuing. The ivy on the mansion walls holds whatever warmth the stone beneath it has accumulated during the day, releasing it slowly into the air immediately around it, in a thin layer that a hand held close to the wall can feel, the wall slightly warmer than the air beyond it, the ivy's surface slightly cooler than the stone behind it, the whole assembly a small system of accumulated and releasing heat that runs all day and into the evening on the energy of the morning's light. By the time the courtyard is in full shadow, the wall is still faintly warm in the places where the stone is thickest and the ivy growth most dense. The warmth is a small thing, easily missed. It is simply there, the day's stored light releasing itself back into the Devon air with the usual unhurried patience of stone. In the last of the afternoon, the ivy on the curtain wall moves in a breeze too slight to be felt at standing height in the open courtyard. The breeze comes across the top of the wall from the north, from somewhere in the woodland above the ravine, and it reaches the uppermost growth on the wall, face before it reaches anything at ground level. So the movement begins in the upper part of the ivy and travels slowly downward as the air descends the wall face. 10,000 small leaves, each one glossy and slightly curved, turned together in a slow traveling wave, the motion moving from the parapet level down toward the base courses in a quiet sequence that takes a few seconds to complete and then settles back into stillness. The light, already low, catches the leaves differently for the duration of the motion, each turned leaf showing its slightly paler underside for a moment before returning to its rest position. The wall behind the ivy does not move. The wall has not moved in the time that matters. The ivy moves through its brief wave of motion and is still, and the stone is as it was, and the brook continues in the ravine below, and the light continues its slow departure from the Devon sky, and the castle holds its ground in the patient, unhurried way it has held it. On this particular ridge above the Gatcombe Brook, for as long as anyone has been counting, a page in a printed book describes a castle in Devon woodland. The entry is not long, a paragraph or two, a location given in relation to the nearest town, which is Totnes, about a mile to the west. A brief account of the two figures said to walk the ruins, one pale and moving along the walls, one associated with the interior rooms of a roofless mansion. A note about the dungeon, the tower, the stone. The reader holds the book in whatever room they are in, far from Devon, far from the South Hams, far from any ravine carrying a brook through old woodland. And for the first time the castle exists for them not as a physical place, in a county they may or may not have visited, but as a location in an imaginative geography that turns out to be considerably larger than any map. Peter Underwood spent a significant portion of his working life collecting accounts of this kind. His surveys of Britain's haunted locations, published across the latter decades of the 20th century, drew together testimony, folklore, and reported experience from hundreds of sites across the country, and Barry Pomeroy appeared in them with some regularity. The castle had been described in regional folklore for a long time before his books gave it a wider audience. What his writing did was place a specific ruin in a specific Devon valley into a national imaginative context, one shared by readers who had never been to the South Hams and might never go, but who could now locate Barry Pomeroy with some precision in the mind. The book gave the castle a second kind of existence. One was the physical castle, the limestone walls, the gatehouse, the woodland, the brook. The other was the castle as a named place in a larger story about the kinds of things Britain contains. That second existence turned out to be durable. Once a place has been named in enough books, described in enough accounts, reported by enough independent witnesses over enough time, it accumulates a kind of cultural weight that is separate from anything the stonework itself holds. Barry Pomeroy had been accumulating that weight quietly for a long time before Underwood's surveys. The earliest substantial written record of something anomalous at the ruins dates to the early 19th century. Sir Walter Farquhar, a physician to the Prince of Wales, described an encounter near the dungeon area during a visit to the castle. What he wrote was careful. He was not a man given to imprecision. He noted what he had seen, acknowledged that he could not account for it, and put the account down in writing in the particular way that physicians sometimes do: observational, structured, specific about the conditions under which the observation was made. That record has been cited in accounts of Barry Pomeroy for 2 centuries. The observation itself has not changed. The same location, the same kind of figure, the same quality of presence that resolved at some point into an absence. There is something worth attending to in the specific persistence of an account like Farquhar's, not because his record confirms anything about the nature of what he saw, but because the account has survived in essentially its original form through 200 years of retelling, and because later accounts have described the same location in the same terms without apparent knowledge of or reference to his. The dungeon area of Barry Pomeroy has been identified independently, across accounts separated by decades and sometimes centuries, as the particular place where the most consistent reports originate. That pattern does not, by itself, explain anything, but it is a real pattern. Something about that enclosed stone passage, the drop in temperature, the way the light falls, the acoustics of the space, or some combination of all of these, has produced a consistent effect in people who have no particular reason to agree. British television in the early years of this century found Barry Pomeroy. Ghost hunting programs, several of them, brought camera crews and investigators and overnight vigils into the ruins and broadcast what they found to audiences considerably larger than those who had read Underwood's surveys. The effect on visitor numbers was measurable. English Heritage, which manages the site, found that the broadcast generated a sustained interest in the castle that expressed itself in bookings, in inquiries, and eventually in a formal events program that included ticketed evening tours and overnight sessions in the ruins. What began as a piece of regional folklore, transmitted through oral tradition and occasional written record, had by the first decade of the 21st century become a modest commercial proposition. The castle's reputation was part of its offer to the world. People came specifically because of the stories, and the stories came specifically because of the castle, and the relationship between the two had been turning slowly over since at least the early 19th century. English Heritage's position on the question of whether the castle is actually haunted is carefully neutral, in the way that institutional positions sometimes are when the question does not have an institutional answer. The guidebooks describe the legends. They describe the White Lady, associated with the dungeon and the walls of St. Margaret's Tower, and the Blue Lady, associated with the interior of the Seymour Mansion ruins. They situate both legends in their historical and folkloric context. They do not endorse them as accounts of objective supernatural reality, and they do not dismiss them as the products of overactive imaginations. The text on the interpretation panels near the dungeon entrance is measured in exactly this way: present, informative, and ultimately open, which is, in its own way, the correct response to the available evidence. The accounts exist. They are real as cultural objects. What they are accounts of remains, and has always remained, a genuinely open question. The town of Totnes, a mile or so to the west, has for some time been a receptive context for this kind of openness. The town has a character distinct from most Devon market towns of comparable size, a long tradition of alternative spirituality, historical mysticism, and a general willingness to treat questions about the nature of experience with more breadth than the strictly empirical allows. That character did not create the Barry Pomeroy legends, which predate Totnes's current reputation by several centuries, but it has provided a living cultural environment in which the legends can be taken seriously, transmitted, elaborated, and passed forward without the particular kind of embarrassment that sometimes attaches to these things in other contexts. The castle and the town have a relationship in this respect. The woodland between them, the mile of lane and field and stream, is not so great a distance that the stories have trouble traveling. A ghost tour group moves through the castle on an October evening, torches in hand. Their guide pauses at the dungeon entrance, and the group closes around the opening in the way that groups do when something is being described. The guide is speaking about Sir Walter Farquhar, the 19th century, the physician, the careful written record, the figure near the dungeon that resolved at some point into an absence. The group is quiet, the torches move. Above and around them, the castle holds its usual dark, the same dark it has held on every October evening for the 9 centuries since the first Norman walls went up on this ridge. The limestone has been here longer than the walls, of course, laid down in shallow tropical seas long before Devon existed as a name for anything. The walls have been here long enough that the distinction between the castle and the ridge has become difficult to feel. The Gatcombe Brook has been running in the ravine below through all of it. The Devon folklore tradition from which the Barry Pomeroy legends draw is not a narrow one. The county has a particularly dense accumulation of stories involving women who return after death, figures whose appearance carries a warning, presences associated with specific physical locations rather than with the general uncanny. The motif of the wronged woman, imprisoned, betrayed, reduced to silence by circumstances that were not of her choosing, appears in folklore across Britain, but it has found particularly persistent expression in Devon, where the landscape of narrow valleys, dense woodland, and isolated estates provided a geography well suited to the imagination of confinement and return. Barry Pomeroy fits that geography precisely. The ridge, the ravine, the trees that close over the lane as it descends, the castle set back from the road in its pocket of woodland. All of this is the right kind of place for the right kind of story. The landscape and the legend fit each other with the comfortable ease of things that have been worn together for a long time. That fit is not coincidental. Landscapes that are genuinely isolating, genuinely enclosed, genuinely capable of producing the sensation of being held apart from the ordinary world, tend to attract and retain stories of this kind. There is something about the physical act of descending the lane toward Barry Pomeroy, the way the trees close overhead, the way the light shifts from open sky to a more dappled, filtered quality, the way the sound of the brook becomes audible before the castle comes into view, that puts a person into a particular register of attention. Not alertness, exactly. Something more like an expanded receptiveness, the slight opening of perception that comes with unfamiliar terrain, with shadow, with the sounds of water and leaves. In that register, ordinary things sometimes take on the quality of the extraordinary, and extraordinary things, if they happen, are more likely to be noticed and remembered. The stone walls of Barry Pomeroy have been receiving that quality of attention for a long time. The castle has been a ruin since the early 18th century, which means it has been the kind of place that invites a certain contemplative slowness for 300 years or more. Before that, when the Seymour family occupied the mansion within the medieval walls, the place would have had the ordinary thick life of a working household. Servants, horses, fires, the smell of food, the noise of construction when the building work was underway. After the family departed in the 1690s, the castle passed into the condition it has since maintained, open to the weather, the woodland, and the slow processes of biological colonization that gradually make a ruin into something almost organic. The ivy on the walls, the ferns in the mortar joints, the mosses that have turned the lower courses of the north-facing sections into something soft and green and entirely alive. The castle is not dead. It is in a different state from the one it was built for, but it is thoroughly inhabited by plants, by small animals, by the seasonal movements of light and shadow, by the brook that has been running in the ravine below through every stage of the building's existence. English heritage understands this. The philosophy guiding the management of Barry Pomeroy is not one of restoration, of attempting to return the castle to an earlier, more intact state. That would require choices about which earlier state to aim for, and Barry Pomeroy has accumulated enough different states over 9 centuries that the choice would be, at minimum, philosophically complicated. Instead, the approach is one of structural stabilization, The goal is to maintain the ruins precisely as they are. Periodic masonry surveys identify joints and courses where water ingress has weakened the structure. Vegetation is managed where root systems threaten to accelerate decay, though not so aggressively that the living quality of the ruins is entirely stripped away. Drainage is attended to. Fresh mortar is applied by conservators on scaffold platforms to joints that have been open to Devon rain for a century or more. The work is deliberate. It is unhurried. It is the kind of work that does not announce itself, that leaves no obvious mark, that simply ensures the castle continues to exist in its current form for the people who will visit it in 10 and 50 and 100 years. There is something quietly significant about that, a human decision, repeated season after season, to keep a particular arrangement of stone in being, not because it is useful, not because it is inhabited in the conventional sense, but because it is genuinely old and genuinely beautiful, and because the stories attached to it are part of what the region contains. The conservator on the scaffold platform, applying mortar to a joint 20 feet above the courtyard floor, is engaged in a form of cultural maintenance as much as a structural one. The joint being closed is not merely a gap in the masonry, it is a small opening in something that belongs, in a sense that is hard to specify but easy to feel, to a much larger whole. The castle belongs to its landscape in the same way. The ridge and the ravine, and the brook and the woodland and the ruins exist together as a single system, each element modified by its relationship to the others. The brook carved the ravine, and the ravine provided the defensible position the Norman lords were looking for, and the position determined the placement of the walls, and the walls altered the drainage pattern of the ridge, and the altered drainage created conditions for the particular community of plants that now colonizes the lower courses of the stonework. Pull any element out and the rest shifts. The bluebells on the woodland floor in April grow partly in the shelter of the curtain wall. The fern in the mortar joint depends on the specific moisture regime created by the intersection of wall and weather. The brook sounds different in the acoustic of the ravine than it would in open country, and the ravine sounds different because the walls at its rim alter the way sound moves through the air above it. These connections are not mythological, they are simply physical, but they are the same kind of connections that stories are made from, the perception that things belong together, that a place is more than the sum of what can be measured in it. Throughout the Asro, the Seymour mansion, roofless now for 3 centuries, sits within the medieval curtain wall with the slightly incongruous quality of a thought in the wrong century. Its mullioned windows open onto sky, its decorated string courses still legible in the warm Devon limestone, record an ambition that was interrupted before it was completed, or completed and then very quickly abandoned. The dates are not entirely clear, and the process by which the mansion passed from occupied family seat to open ruin was gradual rather than sudden. What is clear is that by the early 18th century, the building was substantially roofless, that the rooms were filling with Devon weather, and that the process of biological colonization that has since transformed the interior into its current condition, mossy, ferny, inhabited by birds and small mammals, and the particular quality of light that comes through empty window openings, was already underway. 300 years of rain and growth, and the patient attention of the ivy. 300 years of the brook continuing below. The ghost legends of Barry Pomeroy belong to that long process in a way that is easy to overlook. The stories have been accumulating and transmitting and modifying themselves over at least 2 centuries of documented record, and almost certainly longer if the oral tradition that preceded the written record is included. Each generation of visitors has encountered the castle through a version of the story already shaped by previous encounters, and each encounter has added something, however slightly, to the version that will be passed on to the next. This is how oral tradition works. It is also, somewhat unexpectedly, how the castle's stonework has been maintained. Each generation of conservators working from a record of what previous generations noticed and addressed, adding their observations to the archive, leaving the structure slightly more knowable than they found it. The conservation record and the ghost record are different kinds of document, obviously, but both of them are forms of attention to the same place, sustained across time, accumulating into something larger than any single observation. The lane descending through the woodland to the castle receives its visitors in the same unhurried way it always has. The trees that close overhead on either side are not the same trees that were there in the 16th century. When the Seymour family was building their mansion inside the old Norman walls, or in the 19th century, when Sir Walter Farquhar came down this lane on a Devon afternoon and wrote his careful account afterward. But the woodland type has not changed greatly. The mix of oak and ash and hazel, the dense understory of ferns and mosses, the way the light filters through the canopy in a manner that is recognizably the same regardless of the specific trees producing it. These are continuities of landscape rather than of individual organisms, and they give the approach to the castle a quality that connects across centuries of different visits, different visitors, different purposes for being there. The person descending the lane in October of this year is in some real, if imprecise sense, receiving the same lane that every previous visitor received. The dungeon passage at Barry Pomeroy is cooler than the courtyard above it. This is simple physics. The enclosed stone retains a baseline temperature that the open air does not moderate in the same way, and the particular depth and orientation of the passage mean that it receives less direct sunlight over the course of a day than the areas around it. Investigators who have placed temperature loggers in the dungeon and in the courtyard simultaneously have consistently recorded a differential of several degrees. That differential is not by itself anomalous. It is what physics predicts for a space of that description. The experience of stepping into it, though, is something else. The abrupt shift, the way the body registers the change before the mind has processed it, the particular quality of attention that a sudden drop in temperature tends to produce. That attention is not fear. It is more like a slight expansion of perception, a momentary increase in the resolution at which the surrounding environment is being processed. In that state, the sounds of the passage, the muffled distance of the woodland above, the faint acoustic of the stone, the slight echo that turns ordinary breathing into something slightly more present, are perceived with unusual clarity. Whether that expanded clarity of perception is the basis of the reports that have been made about the dungeon, or whether those reports reflect something that the expanded clarity of perception merely made visible, is precisely the question that cannot be resolved from this or any other distance. What can be said is that the dungeon at Barry Pomeroy is a space that produces a particular quality of experience in the people who enter it, and that the quality of that experience has been described in consistent terms by a remarkably large number of people over a remarkably long period of time. The consistency is the thing worth attending to. Not the explanation, which remains open, but the consistency itself, the persistent specificity of the descriptions, the way the same space keeps producing the same quality of effect in person after person with no apparent coordination between them. The printed book on the table, the one with the entry about Barry Pomeroy, has probably been joined by now by many other documents, articles in local history journals, reports filed by paranormal investigation teams, the English Heritage Guidebook, careful and measured in its presentation of the legends, photographs taken by visitors on phones and cameras, images of the gatehouse and the mullioned windows, and the dungeon entrance, and the curtain wall in every season and every quality of light. The castle exists in all of these simultaneously, a place with a physical reality and a documentary reality and a cultural reality that have been accumulating in parallel since the Norman lords first raised walls on this ridge above the Gatcombe Brook. None of these forms of existence is more real than the others. The stone is the oldest. The stories are among the most durable. The photographs are the newest. All of them are how Barry Pomeroy is known. The lights of Totnes are visible from the castle ridge on a clear evening, scattered in the valley to the west, the town going about its ordinary business of a Devon night, while the woodland between it and the castle fills with the dark that comes after sunset. That dark is not an unusual dark. It is the ordinary dark of a Devon woodland in a season when the nights have grown long enough to make themselves felt. The ash and hazel and oak are bare in November, which means the darkness of the woodland canopy is less total than it is in summer, the starlight reaching down in places through the stripped branches to the woodland floor below. The castle walls catch a little of that faint light on their upper courses and hold it for a moment, pale against the darker sky, before the cloud moves and the ridge returns to its ordinary dark. There is a quality of continuation in that image that belongs to the castle as fully as its stones do. The light changes, has always changed, will always change. The seasons turn. The ivy advances slowly up the wall face in summer and seems to pause in winter, its growth arrested by the cold. Though the plant is never quite still, even in the coldest weeks, there is a cellular activity in the stems pressed against the stone that is too slow to see, but not too slow to happen. The mosses on the lower courses are the same, apparently static, actually proceeding, millimeter by millimeter, in whatever direction the available moisture and light allow. The fern in the mortar joint is technically a single organism with a history of perhaps several decades, depending on when its spore found its way into that particular joint and found the conditions it needed. The brook below is continuous water in the sense that water is continuous. No particular molecule of it has been in the ravine for more than a few days, but the flow itself has been there for longer than the castle above it. All of this continues. The documented history of the castle, the conservation record, the ghost accounts, the visitor books, the academic papers, the television programs, the printed surveys. All of these exist as layers of attention applied to a place that has been here in essentially this form since the Seymour family departed in the 1690s and the Devon weather began its long, patient work on the empty rooms. 300 years of rain through the mullioned windows, 300 years of seasonal change moving across the curtain wall, 300 years of the woodland advancing and retreating and advancing again as the management of the surrounding land shifted over time, 300 years of the brook, continuous and cold, running in the ravine below through every kind of Devon weather. The stories have been running for at least as long in their own way. The White Lady moving along the walls of St. Margaret's Tower, described in the same spatial terms by witnesses who could not have known each other's accounts. The physician's careful record, specific about the location, specific about the conditions, specific about the quality of what he observed. The paranormal investigators seated in the dark of the dungeon at 2 in the morning with their equipment on the stone floor around them, listening to the building acoustics and the brook and the particular silence that enclosed stone makes, when the air outside goes still. The conversation has been going on between this place and the people who come to it for a very long time, and the place has not shown any particular sign of ending it. On November evenings, the Gatcombe Brook runs with more intention than it does in summer, the autumn rainfall having filled it to a level where it makes itself heard without effort. The sound carries up through the bare woodland in a way it cannot in summer, when the leaf canopy absorbs it. From the ruins above, from the courtyard and the roofless mansion, and the top of St. Margaret's Tower, the brook is audible as a continuous low presence, not loud, not insistent, but steady in the way that water is steady when it has somewhere definite to go, and no particular reason to hurry. The Norman lords who first built here would have heard this sound. The Seymour family, moving through the rooms of their mansion in the years when it was still a household rather than a ruin, would have heard it from the windows, the lower ones, the ones in the foundation range, closer to the ravine edge. The sound the brook made then is the same sound it makes now, or close enough that the difference is unmeasurable. Water over stone in a Devon ravine, cold and continuous and entirely indifferent to the question of who is listening. The castle's most persistent quality, the one that outlasts all the specific histories and legends attached to it, may simply be this, that it is a place where the world slows down to a pace that most other places no longer maintain. The lane descending through the woodland, the trees meeting overhead, the light shifting from open sky to dappled shadow, the sound of the brook arriving before the walls come into view. All of this is an approach that cannot be hurried without losing something essential. The ruins themselves reward the same pace. The mortar joints, the surface textures, the way the light moves across the dressed ashlar of the gatehouse at different hours of the day, the way the mullioned windows frame sections of sky and cloud and distant hilltop. These are things that reveal themselves only to someone who has settled into the rhythm of the place and allowed the rhythm of the place to become, for a while, their own. The stories that have accumulated here are part of that rhythm. They are not separate from the place, not an overlay applied to neutral stone by credulous visitors. They belong to Barry Pomeroy in the way that the mosses and the ivy and the ferns belong to it, as something that grew from specific conditions, found purchase in specific surfaces, and has persisted because those conditions have never entirely changed. The dungeon is still cool. The light still falls in the same patterns. The brook still runs below. The walls still stand, maintained with patient care, in essentially the form they have held for centuries. A place like this does not generate legends because its visitors are susceptible to suggestion. It generates them because it has the qualities that legends require: enclosure, age, the sensation of being slightly apart from the ordinary movement of the world, and the patient continuity of a landscape that remembers, in its own way, everything that has happened within it. On the other side of the woodland, in the valley to the west, tautness is going about its evening. The lights in the houses and the shops and the pubs are the ordinary lights of a town in the ordinary middle of a November night. The road that leads from the town toward the castle is mostly quiet at this hour. The lane through the woodland, where it begins its descent, is entirely dark. The trees close over it. The ground falls away toward the ravine, and the sound of the brook comes up through the bare branches in its usual steady way. The castle above the ravine is the same pale gray it always is in this light, the limestone catching what little there is, and returning it in the form of a very faint luminosity against the darker stone and the darker trees and the darker sky. Nobody is in the castle tonight, or nobody documented. The conservation work that has been quietly maintaining these walls for decades does not happen at night. The visitors leave before closing time, and the site is locked. And from that point until morning, what moves through the courtyard in the dungeon passage and the roofless rooms of the Seymour mansion is only air and the sound of the brook and whatever light manages to reach this far through the November cloud. The ivy rests. The mosses continue their imperceptible advance along the lower courses of the wall. The fern in the mortar joint holds its fronds perfectly still. The portcullis grooves in the entrance passage of St. Margaret's Tower are exactly as they were when the last visitor passed through them this afternoon. The stone worn smooth at the edges where the iron once rode up and down on medieval mornings.